History has witnessed many events, both good and bad. We often remember ancient eras for their civilizations, Greek philosophers, Roman structures, and other beauties. However, these eras also had a darker side. In the 21st century, everything is developed, including justice systems that operate globally, respecting human rights. In case of a crime, you would likely be punished by legal systems that adhere to these rights. But for people living in ancient civilizations, it was different. There were no human rights, so punishments could be extreme. Death penalties could involve cutting off various body parts or burning alive, scenes reminiscent of Final Destination. In Mesopotamia, often called the region where many civilizations began and history started, the laws we have all heard of at least once, such as the Code of Hammurabi, show how merciless punishment could be in the ancient period. It was a seminal legal document establishing a detailed system of justice. This code, known for its strict and often brutal system of justice, included several punishments involving the removal of body parts. These severe forms of punishment were applied in various cases as a means of retribution and deterrence. The code mandated the removal of the guilty party's tongue, hands, breasts, eye, or ear in certain circumstances. This approach to punishment reflected the principle of an eye for an eye and was intended to directly correlate the punishment to the nature of the crime committed. The Mesopotamian society under Hammurabi was stratified, and the code defined three main classes: the Amelu, patricians, Muskinu, commoners, and Ardu, slaves. The Amelu held privileged positions and were subject to harsher penalties for crimes, reflecting their higher societal status. In contrast, the Ardu, as slaves, had limited rights and were often the subjects of harsh treatment. For instance, a slave could be branded or tattooed with their owner's name, and attempting to flee or help a slave escape was punishable by death. In terms of debt, the code allowed debtors to offer their wives, children, or slaves as a mancipium, hostage, to work off the debt. The creditor could hold a wife or child for up to 3 years, but if the mancipium died due to the creditor's cruelty, the creditor was obliged to provide a son for son or pay for a slave. This system underscores the harsh and unforgiving nature of Mesopotamian justice. Another civilization and another severe punishment: the Pharaoh's kingdom. In ancient Egypt, the intertwining of religion and law significantly influenced the judicial system, leading to severe and varied punishments for crimes. The penal system was underpinned by a belief that proper burial was essential for entering the afterlife, making death without a proper burial a particularly severe punishment. Punishments were not limited to any social class. Both rich and poor citizens were subject to the law. Mutilation was a common form of punishment for various crimes. This could include cutting off the nose or ears for offences such as encroachment on agricultural property, interfering with offerings, certain thefts, and even involvement in significant conspiracies, like the one recorded in the reign of Rameses III. The severity of these punishments could lead to extreme outcomes, such as suicide, due to the pain or humiliation endured by the victims. In addition to mutilation, other punishments included beating, branding, exile, drowning, beheading, and burning alive. Tomb raiding was considered the worst crime due to the sacred nature of the treasures, often resulting in fatal consequences like drowning or burning alive. The pharaoh played a central role in deciding the fate of criminals for serious crimes. Lesser crimes like personal attacks could result in the offender being whipped, sold into slavery, or sent to work on building projects or mines. Extreme punishments such as the chopping off of hands, noses, tongues, and feet were also inflicted for various offences. The legal system had a hierarchical structure, with the most heinous crimes being judged by the pharaoh or a specially appointed commission. Serious crimes could lead to penal servitude and execution, while lesser offences often resulted in mutilation or flogging. Ancient Greece, the birthplace of wisdom and philosophy, was not behind other civilizations in terms of severe punishments. The same intensity of penalties was applied there as well. Greeks categorized crimes into public and private offences, with each type having distinct punishments. Public crimes, seen as threats to the state, included treason, rebellion, and sedition. These were treated harshly, often resulting in death by execution, exile, or forced suicide through hemlock poisoning. Exile, considered worse than death, meant loss of citizenship and property, and permanent banishment. For serious crimes like murder or treason, offenders could be sold into slavery, a fate that stripped them of all rights and often entailed brutal treatment. Private crimes affected individuals or their property and included theft, assault, and murder. Punishments for these ranged from fines to physical punishments like flogging or mutilation. Fines varied based on the offense, and the offender's financial status and inability to pay could lead to debt bondage or slavery. Physical punishments involved brutal methods such as flogging or even mutilation, including cutting off limbs or branding. Before formal laws were established around 620 BC by Draco, the first lawgiver, Greek society operated on a principle akin to an eye for an eye. Family members of a victim were allowed to exact vengeance on the murderer. However, this led to continuous blood feuds and societal unrest. Under Solon, who further developed Draco's laws, the legal system became more organized. Solon's reforms introduced fines for offenses like rape and theft, and family heads were given discretion to determine punishments for family-related matters, and the famous dictator Caesar's country, ancient Rome. Here, crucifixion stands out as one of the most notorious forms of Roman punishment. It was a form of public terrorism, used primarily against slaves and those considered beneath Roman citizenship, with the intent to humiliate and terrify. Crucifixions were known to have occurred along the Appian Way, following the Spartacus slave revolt, where slaves were left to decay on crosses. However, it's unclear how widespread this practice was, as crucifixion was not typically applied to Roman citizens unless for treasonous acts. Severe punishments of slaves for actual crimes included brutal tortures, like flogging with instruments designed to tear the flesh, such as the flagrum or flagellum, sometimes enhanced with bone or metal. The intensity of these punishments sometimes led to the death of the slaves. To render them incapable of resistance, slaves were sometimes suspended by the arms, with weights attached to their feet, intensifying the torture. Capital punishment in ancient Rome was not limited to crucifixion. It was used for a variety of crimes, including desertion from the army, fleeing slavery, and in some cases, adultery. A notable and unique form of capital punishment was the penal for parricide. This involved the convicted murderer being sewn into a sack with various animals and thrown into a river or ocean, a fate designed to be both a physical and symbolic removal from society. What was happening in the Far East while the West was applying these punishments? It was not too different from the West's way of punishment. Legal systems were deeply influenced by philosophical traditions in ancient China, resulting in a range of severe punishments that were both physical and psychological in nature. The 5 punishments, wuxing, were a series of physical penalties integral to the legal system in pre-modern dynastic China, evolving over time. Before the Western Han Dynasty, 180 to 157 BC, these included tattooing, cutting off the nose, amputation of feet, castration, and death. Following the Sui and Tang dynasties, 581 to 907 AD, these punishments were modified to include penal servitude, banishment, death, and corporal punishment, such as whipping with bamboo strips or flogging with a stick. The legal system, rooted in Confucian philosophy, was designed to maintain social order and harmony. It often resorted to brutal physical and mental punishments to deter crime. Some of these punishments included slow drip torture, a mentally destabilizing method where water, sometimes containing acid, was continuously dripped onto the victim's head, and maiming, which involved branding with hot irons and amputation of limbs or genitals. Another form of punishment was the kangi, a large wooden collar that restricted movement and was inscribed with the criminal's offenses. Beatings with bamboo rods or canes were common, and the severity of the blows depended on the crime. A unique and particularly cruel form of execution was death by 1,000 cuts, where the victim was tied to a post and slowly cut to maximize pain. The Chinese judicial system emphasized a swift and authoritarian approach, with little room for defense. The accused would be brought before a magistrate in a yamen, an office building, where witnesses presented evidence and the magistrate issued a verdict. There was no concept of a defense lawyer or jury in this system, and the process was often swift and final. The emphasis was on punishment and deterrence, reflecting a society that valued order and strict adherence to law.